Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, welcome and congratulations on being this year's recipient of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Human Rights Award.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure being here, and it's a pleasure receiving this award from Moment Magazine, which I have read since its inception. I remember when Leonard Fine and Elie Wiesel were founding the magazine when I was way back in graduate school, and I have read it uninterruptedly. And in recent years, I also want to say, given my new position here at the State Department, how much I admire the way Moment has handled the analysis and the fight against anti-Semitism, charting a very, very solid course, not hysterical, not underwriting, but just hitting the right notes. So congratulations to the team and hats off to the team that's responsible for that.
Well, your mission at the State Department, and I quote now, is to monitor and combat anti-Semitism and to advance, and here I'm quoting, U.S. foreign policy to counter anti-Semitism throughout the world. So where do we stand? Is anti-Semitism dangerously on the rise, and what can the U.S. do about it?
Well, I think it is on the rise. It's on the rise in different forms. It's on the rise, certainly, in physical attacks on Jews, some of which don't grab headlines because they are only, and I put only in big quotation marks, knocking someone's hat off if they're ostensibly wearing a black suit, white shirt, Borsalino or some other kind of hat, fedora, and tzitzit hanging out. Or it's harassing a woman who's pushing a baby carriage in Brooklyn or in Antwerp or in some Paris or in someplace else. We have those kind of things, and then we have more serious incidents as well. I think it's on the rise. I do know that I think people are more conscious of it and possibly reporting it more, so I take that into consideration. But the increases of numbers are so dramatic that even if you qualify for hypersensitivity, more sensitivity. Hyper, I don't mean critical at all. People's more sensitivity to this thing, it's still on the rise.
Why do you think that is? How do you understand the cause of that?
I think it's a multiplicity of reasons. It's never just one reason. In some way, we're in a perfect storm. We have supremacists, white supremacists, separatists, militia groups who feed on anti-Semitism, who nurture their followers on anti-Semitism. And they are becoming more emboldened, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. And the irony is sometimes they demonize the Jew, but then proclaim their great support for Israel. They sort of make that weird separation. And that's one factor. I think we also see other places on the political spectrum where it's coming, maybe certainly not with the same violence and vituperativeness, but in a very effective way in terms of their objective as well. I think the other thing that we can't ignore, and we've been so conscious of it the past few months and the past few weeks, is there's a delivery system now that didn't exist years ago. When I first started working on Holocaust denial issues, if you wanted to get material about Holocaust denial, but proclaiming Holocaust denial, etc., you had to often get it sent in a plain envelope to a P.O. box because it was illegal to go across international lines. Different countries would stop it. Now, all you have to do is go to Mrs. Google or Mr. Twitter
Right.
or whomever it might be and put in something. And not only can you put it up, but you have an audience, you have a megaphone. Yes. And that certainly is helping.
Which raises a question that it goes beyond how much journalistic attention is being paid to anti-Semitic events. Social media. I mean, to what extent is the rise of social media giving public space, big audiences to ideas that have always been there, but have been on the sidelines before?
I don't want to beat up on social media. Social media is like a knife. I describe it as like a knife. A knife in the hands of a surgeon can save your life. A knife in the hands of a murderer can take your life. It's how it's used. It's how they monitor themselves. It's how they live up to the standards that they have proclaimed um, for monitoring the what is said on their sites. So social media is a big part of the problem, but it's also a big part of the way in which we communicate
Mm.
and further aspects of Jewish life. So it's a tricky situation.
Which countries give you the greatest concern?
You have an hour? You know, I have, since I've been in office, I don't want to, list in terms of countries, but I've been to the Middle East. Now, the Middle East was a different kind of thing, and not just Israel, but I was in the Gulf, I was in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I'm going to hopefully be in Bahrain in the not too distant future. That was for a more positive element. So let's set that aside for a moment. I've just come back from Western Europe. I was in the United Kingdom. I was in Brussels, in Belgium, and in France. And there's what to be concerned in many of those countries. In some of those countries, it depends where. It depends what. There's vibrant Jewish life. Let's not ignore that. Let's start from that. In all of those countries, there's vibrant Jewish life. I happened to be in Antwerp on a Friday afternoon, and racing through the streets of Antwerp were lots of people in Hasidic garb, ultra Orthodox garb, on scooters, on bicycles with the plastic bags, having bought stuff for Shabbat. It was very vibrant. But at the same time, you know that there are problems there and there are problems in other countries. I'm going to South Africa, where there's a community that feels under pressure. I'm going to be in Morocco, which has a much more positive attitude. And then or more positive situation, rather. And not so long ago, I was in Argentina and in Chile. And I went to Argentina to be there on the anniversary, the 28th anniversary of the AMIA bombing, the JCC, their equivalent of the JCC. And Robert, I've been in Auschwitz and Birkenau with people who were in Auschwitz-Birkenau as prisoners. I've been there for ceremonies. I've been there for memorials. It was, and of course, it's an overwhelming, indescribable experience. But I felt some of that emotion, much of that emotion, when I stood in the street before the now rebuilt AMIA building. And at the moment the sirens went off, the street was packed with thousands of people. And each of us had been given a photograph of a victim before we entered the area where the memorial would be. And we all held them up. It was overwhelming, in part because 28 years passed and it still hasn't been solved. And many people there believe it will never be solved specifically. And you were standing amongst people who had family in the building, knew people in the building, had been in the building. So, there's no dearth of places to which we can look for problems. At the same time, let me focus, maybe uncharacteristically, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, on some of the positive. I mentioned going to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, to UAE, and my deputy has been to Bahrain, and I hope to be there soon as well. No one would have, and I'm going to Morocco next week. No one would have dreamt that the Abraham Accords would bring the results that they're bringing. I'm not talking so much about the relationship with Israel. That's the remit, that's the responsibility of other people working not very far from where I'm sitting right now in the State Department. But in terms of their willingness to address issues of anti-Semitism, to recognize, and of course, Saudi Arabia is not yet part of the Abraham Accords, one hopes that eventually they will be, but to recognize that attitudes towards Jews and the geopolitical, very important, very, very severe geopolitical situation in the Middle East for Israel and the Palestinians are two separate, can be seen and should be treated as two separate issues. I'll tell you an interesting anecdote. I know you love good anecdotes. I'm sitting in Saudi Arabia with an older sheikh who's been put on my list to visit. And I don't think he had gotten the message that the kingdom was sort of looking at Jews and the history of Jews in a different light. And he said to me, Ambassador Lipstadt, if Israel solved the Palestinian crisis, there'd be no anti-Semitism. So I put, while listening to my mortarboard, my cap and gown went back on. I'm thinking as an academic, seems to me there was anti-Semitism before there was an Israel-Palestinian problem. Seems to me there was anti-Semitism before there was an Israel, before there was Zionism,
Right.
millennia. But I didn't want to get into that kind of match with him in terms of history. So instead, I said, after a bit of a pause, I said, in my country, there was a surge, a absolute skyrocketing of contempt for, hatred of Muslims after 9/11. So much so that in New York City, the polyglot capital of the United States, the city, I believe it was the city council, forbade permission for the building of a Muslim community center and mosque adjacent to Ground Zero. You may well remember this incident.
Yes, of course.
I'm sure you do. And I said, many people I know, including many Jews, thought that was the wrong decision. Why should a Muslim who wants to go and worship, wants to go and pray, or wants to take her family for different events and celebrations at a community center be prevented from doing so because other Muslims had attacked the World Trade Center? He said, you're absolutely right. There is no change. That's a no connection. That's a political issue, and this is a hostility towards a group that religiously identifies. So I paused for a dramatic moment, and then I said, well, that's the same thing with anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
Irrespective of how you feel about the Israel-Palestinian issue crisis, that doesn't give you license to go around hating Jews or fomenting hatred of Jews. And of course, Saudi Arabia was for many decades, I don't think it's not the case right now any longer, one of the exporters of imams who would go to Europe and other places and preach anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So they listened to me. I met with fairly high-ranking ministerial officials. I met with one deputy foreign minister who, when I entered his office, put out his hand and said, I come from a city of Jews, Medina. And I said, Medina. And he said, correct. So does that mean everything is solved? No, of course not. Does that mean there aren't human rights problems in Saudi Arabia? No, of course not. There are human rights problems in our country too. But does that mean there's an opening of line of communication? I think there is, and that's something that is affirming.
I'm curious what you have to say about another region of the world. If you had told me a few decades ago there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, I would assume I don't know who's going to win, but I know who's going to lose. It must be bad. It must be bad for the Jews. Instead, Ukraine has a Jewish president, had a Jewish prime minister, and for all his sins, Vladimir Putin, one thing he doesn't seem to be is an anti-Semite, unless I'm not reading him carefully enough.
Yeah, I don't know what Vladimir Putin is. I do know that in the opening days of the war, and then again more recently, he talked about the denazification of the Ukraine and we're going after the Nazis. It was Holocaust distortion, grade A1,
Right.
And that was clearly something that was disturbing. Then at another moment in the course of the war, he the Kremlin sort of warned the Jews and threatened to close down the Jewish agency in part, because of the seeming support of Israel, limited support of Ukraine. So I don't know who's an anti-Semite and who's not an anti-Semite. I'm very careful of labeling anyone an anti-Semite. I don't know what's in the person's heart. As I like to say, that's between them and their cardiologist. But I know when I see actions that are anti-Semitic or foment anti-Semitism. And we've seen some of that coming out of Russia. And who knows if the war goes badly for them, how that will turn out. This is not a good situation at all.
Yes. I wonder if you ever encountered this problem. I asked you earlier about social media, and there are calls for social media to be more responsible about screening hate speech and included within that anti-Semitism. Two huge social media companies, Facebook and Twitter, are American companies, but the vast majority of their users are in other countries. And some of those countries have laws against hate speech. I wonder, have you ever found yourself advocating in other countries an approach to anti-Semitic speech that, frankly, would be thrown out of court in the United States as an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment?
As an American diplomat, as an official of the American government, which I still amaze myself when I say that, child of two immigrants, I don't do that. But what I do say, whether it's in this country or in other countries, that I would hope that these platforms would abide by their own regulations, by their own standards that they have set. I meet with counterparts in other countries. They are freer to call on these companies to regulate, because as you rightly put it, in the United States, these cases would be thrown out of court for First Amendment rights, and we treasure the First Amendment. It can be annoying, but it's hanging on by its fingernails, and I hope it manages to do that. But I think there has to be some sort of sense of responsibility, because it can be very dangerous.
You have encountered some interesting issues in your role at the State Department that I hadn't expected. I'm not talking about desecrating synagogues or anything, but one of them involved a proposed European law on the slaughter of animals, on the humane slaughter of animals, it was called. People shouldn't be able to slaughter livestock without first stunning them. What was the problem here? Explain it.
The problem is, and this, but by the way, applies equally to the Muslim and the Jewish community, because halal, the equivalent of kashrut in Muslim ritual and kashrut in Jewish ritual, calls for when animals are slaughtered. It's not ritual slaughter; it's religious slaughter. When they're slaughtered so that they can be eaten according to the rules of kashrut and halal, they should be alive and then killed 1, 2, 3. And in some countries, there have been laws forbidding it, more so in recent years as an anti-Muslim thing, or as a what we call in shorthand PETA, a protection of animals issue. Right. What we argued, there was actually just last week, I was at a meeting at the EU, sponsored by the EU, with strong American encouragement, but virtually every EU country was represented, to talk about the attempted bans on on religious slaughter. And what the argument we made is that we didn't get into, stunning and what works better and what doesn't and how fast the animal dies, etc. We said, this is a matter of religious freedom. And if you proclaim, one country that considering this ban has written religious freedom into its constitution. And if you proclaim religious freedom, then you've got to allow people to practice their religion, especially if the bill you are proposing has exemptions for hunting, not exactly a very humane way of killing an animal, right. Fishing. Some of them have exemptions for cooking of lobster, where you take a live animal across certain shellfish, where you boil them alive, for bullfighting. So it just seems strange that this should be such a focus. But it's not, we didn't project it, and I wasn't there saying this is anti-Semitic. But what I did argue at the meeting, or contend at the meeting, was that while it's clearly not an anti-Semitic act, on the European continent, in the lifetime of people we both know, 2 out of every 3 Jews alive was murdered. Anything that's going to make Jewish life less viable, given the remnant that is there. You've traveled, many of the people listening to this have traveled, watching this have traveled. And so often when we go to a city where there's a gorgeous synagogue, lovingly restored sometimes by the community, sometimes by the government, UNESCO, we know that I was just in such a synagogue in Antwerp, gorgeous, gorgeous synagogue, beautiful, colorful inside. And with wonderful acoustics. I don't know, looks like it sat 1,000 people. I can assure you that even in Antwerp, with its burgeoning Jewish population, that there aren't 1,000 people there on a Shabbat morning. Or you go to other places where the synagogue is a museum. The
Yeah,
synagogue is, a place for tourists to
sure.
visit. It's not because the Jewish community said, "Oh, let's leave here and go move someplace else." It's because they were murdered. So anything that's going to make Jewish life harder, make Jewish life less viable, particularly in a continent which once had the most vibrant Jewish life, is something that I'm concerned about.
You are now an ambassador, but you could have been just as easily honored for your work as a professor at Emory University, for your writing, and you could have been, yeah, I'm sure you were honored for your landmark victory in a British courtroom against the revisionist historian David Irving, who sued you for libel for your calling him what he was, a Holocaust denier, and you proved the point in court. So you've enjoyed influence as a private citizen on the subject of anti-Semitism. What can be done from the role of ambassador that you now hold? What can be done that's very different from what you can do as a, a public figure?
No, you zero. We've talked before. We talked when I was in the academic world, and exactly as you describe it, I had a lot more freedom. I could write what I want. I didn't have to have it checked, cleared, collaborate, discussed. I could say what I want, go where I want, et cetera, et cetera. And I taught 3 courses a year,
Hmm.
seminars. I wrote a lot. I mean, it wasn't like I was lounging around. I was always writing, but 3 courses a year. And as I said to someone, I thought that was a full-time job, you know. And in fact, when I got the call from the White House saying that the president was planning to nominate me for this position, I had a moment of hesitation. Do I really want to leave this cushy, better paying job for much more, to work in one of the most complex bureaucracies in the world, the United States Department of State? And I said to a friend, I'm not sure I'm going to do it. And she said to me, Deborah, you have to do it. I said, why? She said, because you can make a difference.
Hmm.
And it caused me full stop. It caused me full stop because I think that so many people I know, certainly readers of Moment magazine, would like that as their epitaph, at age 120, as we say in Jewish tradition, but you made a difference.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to do that I couldn't do. So how do I make a difference? I have a chance. First of all, I had a pretty big megaphone before, but I've got a much bigger megaphone. I realized that just a few days into the job, I was sitting across from the CEO of a very large corporation, which had engaged in some overt acts that clearly were anti-Semitic or could be interpreted as anti-Semitic against American citizens. And I said, we're very concerned about that. And I looked at his face and I knew he heard the United States government speaking.
Hmm.
And of course, I'd been empowered to do that by
Hmm.
my boss, that's Secretary Blinken, to whom I respond directly. And suddenly I realized, I wasn't puffed up. I was humbled by it. I was sort of overwhelmed by it. So it's on one hand when I speak out, and it's not me acting as a cowboy deciding what I want, but in consultation with the wonderful team I have in my office and with colleagues across the building. I'm speaking in the name of the United States government. So that is overwhelming. That is an overwhelming, awesome privilege and awesome responsibility. But there's another part which I didn't anticipate, and it also has sort of left me, I don't know, wondering, just in wonder. I have the opportunity to ensure that where appropriate, the fight against anti-Semitism becomes a fundamental part of American foreign policy. So that when the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, speaks out in the most anti-Semitic fashion, that when my office responds, we're not responding in a vacuum. We're responding together with colleagues who deal with Iran, colleagues who deal with the Middle East, that the spokesman of the State Department is speaking out, is reiterating what we've said, so that I may give up a little bit of my freedom to just decide I'm going to write an op-ed and it'll appear in Moment or the Washington Post or the New York Times or Forward or wherever it might appear. But I'm ensuring that the message goes out that the fight against anti-Semitism is something of prime importance to this government. I've talked to the secretary about this, and in fact, less so, but certainly to the president and the vice president, and they get it. They get it that anti-Semitism is like the canary in the coal mine. When that canary goes over, get out of the coal mine. And it's the canary in the coal mine of democracy. If you adhere if you're an anti-Semite, look, the fight against anti-Semitism, if it only affected Jews, would be bad enough, would be worthwhile enough to protect a segment of your population that is being subjected to prejudice. That's reason enough. But it isn't the only reason, or it isn't even the whole reason. As I say, anti-Semitism, as the canary in the coal mine, is a threat, is a warning. That canary is a warning to the fragility of democracy. If you believe in if you're an anti-Semite, then you think, well, the justice system isn't fair because it's controlled by Jews. The government in general isn't fair because it's controlled by Jews. The media isn't fair because it's controlled by Jews. Jews are conspiring. Elections are controlled. You lose faith in the democratic institutions, so that I can't, as a historian, I can think of no democracy, or even countries that weren't democracies, but certainly no democracy that tolerated anti-Semitism and remained a vibrant democracy. Yeah. And the best case in point is Weimar Germany, interwar Germany. I'm not suggesting that a Holocaust is looming, or a Nazi Third Reich equivalent is looming. I'm not suggesting that at all. But I'm just looking at Weimar Germany as a fragile democracy that was beginning to thrive. But as the anti-Semitic forces became stronger and stronger, along with other forces, but certainly the anti-Semitic forces, its fate was sealed.
You're reminding me of Poland in 1981, when an anti-Semitic group emerged on the political spectrum shortly before martial law was declared. And I remember first expressing this amazement to my Polish fixer translator: how can you have an anti-Semitic movement when there are virtually no Jews here? And her answer was, well, actually, I guess the prime minister's second wife was Jewish. A very wise Italian journalist told me, the point is, you really don't need Jews for anti-Semitism.
That's right. That's
right. They
anti-Semitism without Jews is it shouldn't surprise us.
Yeah.
It shouldn't surprise us, because anti-Semitism is often called by historians, and rightfully so, the longest or the oldest hatred.
Mm-hmm.
It's so baked into the weeds, into the soil of civilization, starting with the New Testament depiction of the death of Jesus, and how that depiction was used by subsequent leaders of the church. I'm not suggesting it had to go in that direction. But outside of Notre Dame, I'm pretty sure it's outside of Notre Dame. There are two statues. One is of the church.
Church and synagogue, yes.
Yes, exactly. And a beautiful woman, beautifully coiffed. And synagoga is a woman, her hair is disheveled, her dress is disheveled, she's blinded. I think there's a serpent on her. In other words, this is the church, and this is the devil, the synagogue. It's there so deeply that it's very hard to fight, and you don't need Jews if that is out there. Now, I don't want to suggest it's only the church. Well, the Soviet Jewry movement, it moves out of the church, it moves into communism, it moves into eugenics, the eugenic movement of the 19th and into the 20th century, including in this country, motivated deeply by anti-Semitism.
Yes.
It's all over the political spectrum. It's ubiquitous. So
I,
It's there.
I'm curious what you made of something I read recently in a newspaper account of an anniversary of the Tree of Life shootings in Pittsburgh. There was a
Hmm.
commemoration of the victims, and a man was quoted as saying that he felt as though a 50-year holiday, a 50-year vacation had ended. In other words, and I wonder, do you ever have the sentiment that an unusual time when in our country anti-Semitism was politically and even to some extent socially unacceptable, that period is now over and that we're living in a society with different rules?
I think that's very well put. That's very well put. And to some degree, I think you're right. I'm hoping I can help change that even in a little way. But I remember, Robert, when I used to visit countries in Europe in the 80s, 90s, even into the aughts, and I wanted to find the synagogue, and people would say to me, "Oh, just when you get to the street, look up and down the street, and you'll see the gendarmes with their
Yeah,
machine guns, and
yeah.
you'll know you found the synagogue." Today, the same can be said for most synagogues in America. You know, either they have a armed officer outside and congregants patrolling, or maybe just congregants. But no, my synagogue, we haven't gone through the front door, I think, in 4 years.
Hmm. Uh, One other question. You know, you've been awarded Moment's Ruth Bader Ginsburg Human Rights Award, and I wonder, did you ever know or meet
I
Justice
never
Ginsburg?
met her. Much to I actually was once. We were once honored by at a UJA Lion of Judah event, and I sat next to her, but I didn't really know her. But I do have Ruth Bader Ginsburg socks, which I wear periodically. But she was when you look at her story and you hear her deep seated commitment to equality, to fairness. It comes out of such Jewish roots. And when she once talked, I think she was on medication, so she fell asleep during the State of the Union address. And afterwards, she said her granddaughter called her and said, "Bubby, you can't do that." And my heart melted.
Well, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, once again, congratulations on your being named this year's recipient of Moment Magazine's Ruth Bader Ginsburg Human Rights Award. And thank you very much for talking with us.
Thank you. I love our conversations. And even if you don't give me another award, I'm always willing to be in conversation with you, Robert.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
very well.
Take care.
Take care.